In Stone Age, players play as ancient tribes, trying to develop their civilization by building buildings and researching new technologies. The player with the most points at the end of the game is the winner of the game. The game ends either when one of these piles of building tiles is depleted, or there aren't enough cards left in the civilization card deck to fill this row of 4 cards. In Stone Age, the game is played in rounds. Each round has 3 parts. In the first part of a round, players will take turns. On their turn, that player will choose one of the spots on the board that does not already have any of their workers assigned to it and assign one or more workers to that spot. Each spot is limited by the number of these circles that are associated with that action that player would like to take later in the round. After a player has chosen a spot on the board, then the next player will take a turn placing workers, and players will continue to take turns until all of workers of all players have been placed somewhere on the board. Once this happens, the next part of the round will begin. Players will take turns performing all of the actions where they have placed workers on the board. Each action is a little bit different. For example, each of the resource gathering spaces around the side of the board, that player will roll a number of dice equal to the number of workers they have assigned to that space. For example, over here on the harvesting food space, I have assigned 2 workers. Therefore, I get to roll 2 dice. I will add up the total on the dice and divide it by the value of the resource that is present at that space. In this case, each food resource has a value of 2. I rolled a 7, so I'll divide 7 by 2 and round down, getting a total of 3, which is the amount of food I gain from this action. After performing the action, I will also retrieve my workers from that space to indicate that I have already done it. Each of these other spaces works in exactly the same way. However, these other resources have higher values and are thus a little bit harder to gather than food. Also, at the harvesting food space, any number of workers may be present, whereas at the other spaces, a maximum of 7 workers may be present, divided among all players at each of those locations. The tool space allows a player to assign a worker and upgrade a tool, either by taking a token from the supply and placing it onto their board, or once players already have 3 tools, improving one of the tools that they already have in play. Tools can be used while gathering resources to improve the die roll result of that player. For example, when I had gathered food and rolled a 7, I could have used one of my tools by rotating it and adding 1 to that total to make it an 8, and now I would gather 4 food instead of just 3. At the end of each round, my tools will become unrotated and ready for use in the next round. The hut space down here requires a player to place 2 workers, but allows them to retrieve those workers and gain a new worker from the general supply to use in later rounds of the game. The building spaces over here allow players to build buildings, which will score them points. Each building has a recipe along the bottom of the tile, which indicates what number and type of resources that player must pay to the bank in order to build that building. If a player is unable to or doesn't want to pay that cost, they can simply retrieve their worker from the building tile without doing anything. If they do build the building, they take it from that stack, add it to their player board, and add that many points to their score. If a player plays a worker on a civilization card, they have the option of buying that card by paying resources back to the bank. The cost of a card is indicated on the top of the slot where that card is located on the board. For example, this card would cost me 4 resources. Notably, food cannot be used to pay for these cards or to pay for buildings. When a player buys a card, they gain 2 bonuses. The first is an immediate effect listed on the top of the card, and the second is a point scoring bonus which that player will gain at the end of the game. There are 2 different types of ways to score points from civilization cards. First, there are certain symbols at the bottom of each of these cards. Players will score points based on the sets that they have collected of civilization cards with unique symbols on them. More unique symbols, more points. Players will also score points for these sand-colored cards based on other things that they have done during the game. For example, if I buy the civilization card, it essentially means that every building tile that I have at the end of the game will score me an additional 2 points. there are cards that will increase your scoring for tools, for buildings, for workers, and for your agricultural level, which I'll discuss in a moment. After each player has taken their turn and removed all of their workers from the board, then it's time for all players to feed their workers. Each worker will require 1 food, which must be paid if able. If a player runs out of food before they are able to feed all of their workers, they can choose to either feed their workers with other resources they have, or to lose 10 points. If that player doesn't have enough resources to feed all of their workers, then they must lose 10 points. If a player plays on this space on the board, on their turn they can remove that worker from the board to increase their agricultural score by 1. When feeding workers at the end of each round, each player can lower the cost that they have to pay for those workers by the level of their agriculture. So for example, the green player has 5 workers. Normally they would have to pay 5 food at the end of every round. However, their agricultural score is 1. 5 minus 1 is 4. That player has to pay only 4 food. Then a new round of the game will commence, with players again placing workers onto the board, and after that, retrieving those workers and performing actions, and finally feeding their workers again. Continue this process until either one of the piles of building tiles has been completely depleted, or when there aren't enough cards left in the deck to refill this row of 4 cards. That's the end of the game. Players will count up their score by looking at how many points they scored during the game and adding their bonuses for civilization cards with unique symbols, as well as bonuses for tools, buildings, workers, and their agricultural level.